Hello and welcome. My name is Owen Bucher Flynn, and I'm a postgraduate MSc counselling student at Bangor University. Today, I'll be presenting my dissertation research exploring the relationships between men's mental health, traditional masculine role norms, and meaning in life. More specifically, the study investigates whether masculine role norms and existential meaning independently or interactively influence the psychological well-being of men. So this study focused on three core concepts that appear increasingly relevant within contemporary discussions around men's mental health. So firstly, traditional masculine role norms. Secondly, meaning in life, particularly the distinction between the presence of meaning and the search for meaning in life. And thirdly, psychological well-being. So the question underlying this study was how these three domains relate to one another and whether meaning in life may potentially buffer some of the negative effects associated with traditional masculine role norms. Looking first of all then at men's mental health in itself. So this topic has received increasing attention, both academically and publicly in recent years, particularly in relation to increasing rates of depression and suicide in men. And these tend to be associated with emotional isolation and reduced help-seeking behavior as well. The research in this area consistently suggests that men experience pressure to conform to social expectations surrounding independence, emotional control, and resilience. Now, these are traits that are not inherently negative in themselves, but difficulties can emerge when emotional vulnerability or help-seeking come to be perceived as incompatible with masculine identity. This then creates a psychological tension where the same norms that may support social identity can also discourage emotional expression and engagement with support. So, what are traditional masculine role norms in themselves? We understood them here to be gendered expectations for behavior and roles in life that are received on a cultural and societal level. So there's a substantial body of research suggesting that adhering to these traditional masculine role norms is associated with increased psychological strain and decreased psychological well-being. Studies have been linking traits like emotional control, competitiveness, dominance, and self-reliance with higher levels of depression, anxiety, distress, and suicidality. One way to understand this is through the concept of hegemonic masculinity, which is one that describes culturally dominant expectations surrounding masculinity, particularly toughness, autonomy, emotional restraint. Importantly, though, these relationships are not always consistent across different contexts or groups of men, suggesting that masculinity may function in more flexible ways than earlier models sometimes assume. Moving on to meaning in life, in contrast here to the kind of risks that we see associated with rigid masculine norms, research into meaning on life shows a more protective psychological resource in this area. So generally, we're referring here to an existential purpose in life, a sense of coherence and a sense of significance. So by existential purpose, we are talking about confronting deep and essential questions in life with a view to direct oneself in a specific direction. Research into this area suggests that individuals with stronger sense of meaning often report greater well-being, greater emotional resilience, and reduced psychological distress. Existential and meaning-centered therapeutic approaches also emphasize the importance of purpose and value-based living in supporting mental health, which raises an interesting possibility within the field of men's mental health specifically, which is that existential reflection and meaning making may help individuals navigate, transcend, reinterpret restrictive masculine expectations. So then, with an understanding of these three core concepts, what we aim to do in this study was to examine the relationships between traditional masculine role norms, meaning in life, and psychological well-being in men. In terms of the role norms, we looked specifically at success preoccupation, inhibited affection, and restrictive emotionality. With meaning in life, we explored two separate dimensions, which were the presence of meaning in life and the search for meaning in life. And when it came to well-being outcomes, we measured these through looking at a sense of overall well-being, positive emotion, and negative emotion. And I would be happy to answer more questions about this in the question section as to how specifically we defined those and understood them. So we tested three hypotheses here. Firstly, we looked at stronger adherence to traditional masculine role norms as a predictor of poorer well-being. Secondly, we looked at the possibility that greater presence of meaning would predict more positive emotional outcomes. And thirdly, we investigated whether meaning in life might moderate the relationship between masculine role norms and well-being. So in other words, whether it would offer a potentially buffering effect against negative experiences. To investigate these hypotheses, we used a quantitative design using questionnaires. Traditional masculine role norms and meaning were treated as predictive variables, while well-being outcomes were treated as dependent variables. So we used Spearman's correlations to examine the relationships between the variables in hypothesis 1 and hypothesis 2. And in hypothesis 3, we used a multiple regression analysis to test whether meaning moderated the relationship between masculine role norms and well-being through interaction effects. We had a total of 139 participants initially, but this had to be reduced to 49 as this was the number that fully provided complete data to be used for the final analysis. Participants were all adult men recruited through Bangor University's SONA participant panel, and the study used an online self-report format. So participants were able to complete the questionnaires remotely. And we obtained ethical approval through Bangor University School of Psychology. Looking now at the specific measures we used for the questionnaires, we firstly used the PERMA profiler to measure psychological well-being, including positive emotion, negative emotion, and overall well-being. The Meaning in Life questionnaire, or MLQ, was used to measure the presence of meaning and the search for meaning in life. And the Masculine Role Inventory was used to measure dimensions of traditional masculine role norms, which again were emotional restriction, inhibited affection, and success preoccupation. All three of these measures are established within research and have been used for multiple previous research projects. Moving on now then to look at the results. The findings provided mixed support for our hypotheses overall. Hypothesis 1 predicted that stronger adherence to traditional masculine role norms would relate to poorer well-being, and this was not reliably supported, which was a bit of a surprise considering it was in previous research, but we'll move on to look at why that might have been in a moment. Hypothesis 2 received partial support with 3 out of 4 of our sub-hypotheses supported, one of them very significantly reported. In particular, presence of meaning showed relationships with emotional well-being to be broadly consistent with our expectations, but the search for meaning showed a more inconsistent pattern than we had initially predicted. Finally, for hypothesis 3, well, this was not supported, so we found no significant interaction effects between masculine role norms and meaning in predicting well-being, which again contradicts previous research, and we will look at in a moment. Let's look at the hypotheses in more detail. So with hypothesis 1, the absence of clear associations here between masculine role norms and well-being, as I said, it contrasts with a substantial body of previous research. One possible interpretation for this is that these relationships may be more context dependent than earlier models assume. So, for example, masculine norms may operate differently depending on social environment, age, identity, culture, or how individuals interpret masculinity itself. Another possibility here is that self report measures may not fully capture how men experience or express masculine norms internally. Overall, the findings suggest that masculinity may not function as a single stable psychological construct across all expressions of masculinity. Hypothesis 2, however, produced much clearer findings. As I said before, it was partially supported, but this was 3 out of 4 of our sub-hypotheses. And what we saw here was that the presence of meaning appeared to function as a relatively stable, positive factor associated with well-being, as shown in previous research as well. However, the search for meaning showed a more complex picture and a more inconsistent pattern, as one of the sub-hypotheses relating to this was consistent with predictions and the other was not. So specifically, what we saw was that the search for meaning was not strongly associated with negative emotion. So we see really here that the search for meaning and the presence of meaning are operating in slightly different ways within this sample, which might suggest that these constructs are not necessarily opposite ends of the same construct as originally thought, but that they may be psychologically distinct experiences which are constructed in different ways. One interpretation here is that the presence of meaning reflects a more integrated or established sense of existential coherence, whereas the search for meaning may represent meaning still in the process of development through reflection, through uncertainty, or through questioning, however that may be. Importantly, though, searching for meaning did not appear consistently linked with poorer well-being. This has interesting implications for therapy because it suggests that existential questioning may sometimes function as a constructive or growth-oriented process rather than purely as an indicator of distress, as is hypothesized in the MLQ. So finally, looking at hypothesis 3. So this hypothesis explored whether meaning in life moderated the relationship between masculine role norms and well-being, but we found no significant interaction effects here as in hypothesis 1. There are several explanations that might account for this. Firstly, participants who strongly identify with traditional masculine role norms may also be less likely to recognize or openly report these traits through self-report measures. It requires a certain amount of self-consciousness to engage in this, and also a certain willingness to look at and reflect on these role norms to begin with in order to actually access this as a participant. Secondly, with that in mind, university populations may display lower endorsement of traditional masculine roles overall. And finally, contemporary discussions surrounding gender and masculinity are really, they're increasingly politically and socially polarized, which may plausibly have an influence on how participants interpret and respond to psychologically sensitive measures. So the question then is, what does all of this mean for the field, and what are the limitations of this project? So research increasingly suggests that masculinity is shaped by factors such as culture, sexuality, political orientation, age, and socioeconomic context. Contemporary masculinity may also be undergoing significant change. So what we're saying here is that newer or hybrid forms of masculine identity are emerging alongside more traditional norms in the current climate of political discourse and public discourse. So the findings that we do have suggest that relationships between masculinity, meaning, and well-being may be considerably more flexible, more variable, and more socially influenced than simplified models can account for. Turning then to what this means for counsellors in the actual therapy room. In terms of implications here, the findings emphasize really the importance of approaching men's mental health with openness and with flexibility. So rather than assuming that existential questioning or searching for meaning necessarily implies dysfunction, practitioners may benefit from viewing these processes as potentially constructive forms of reflection and identity development in themselves. This might also help practitioners move beyond rigid assumptions regarding how men are expected to function psychologically and support more individualized and context sensitive approaches to therapy. So, in terms of future research, this could be built on in several ways, these findings. Firstly, more qualitative and mixed method approaches may help capture more of the complexity of how masculinity and meaning are experienced subjectively and in a changing paradigm as well. Future studies might benefit from exploring more diverse populations too and emerging forms of gender identity that are still yet to be fully understood and defined more generally. Finally, though, contemporary social environments, including with social media, political discourse, AI mediated communication, might also have an influence on how individuals construct and communicate meaning, how they construct and communicate identity, and how they construct and communicate emotional experience in itself. So these factors may become increasingly important in future models of men's mental health and really, really deserve consideration. In conclusion, then, this study provides further insight into relationships between traditional masculine role norms, meaning in life, and psychological well-being in men. So, while some of the findings align with existing theory, the overall pattern suggests these relationships are not as uniform or as straightforward as was previously thought. Most noticeably, the findings reinforce the potential importance of meaning, particularly the presence of meaning within men's mental health, while also highlighting the complexity and contextual nature of masculinity in itself. Overall, the study supports a need for broader and more flexible approaches to understanding men's psychological well-being. So that brings us to the end of my presentation today. Thank you so much for listening. I'd be very happy to answer any questions that you may have. I will provide all my references on the next page as well. Thanks once again.